From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and ahead for you today, K-State's Glynn Tonsor with this week's cattle market segment. Among other things, Glynn will share information on the advent of those alternative protein products in the marketplace and their likely influence on the beef trade. He's been on the speaking circuit covering that topic of late. Then, the senior director of the Beef Checkoff's Sustainable Research Program, Sara Place. She'll talk about how the cattle industry checks far more sustainability boxes than most people realize. She was a recent guest of the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State. Later then, this week's 4-H segment, K-State's Taylor Flowers visits with Jeff Wickman about the 4-H Foods and Nutrition Project. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
It's good to have you along with us for another Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. For openers, this week's cattle market segment and some thoughts about a variety of things, including the role of alternative proteins in the marketplace. More on that later. Glynn Tonsor is along once again. He is a livestock economist with K-State Research and Extension. Glynn, first to the positive, coming off of another week to the upside in the fed and feeder cattle trades, the momentum continues in the right direction.
Yes, it does. And to break that down, we'll just start with the cash market because that's where that story was the most positive and strong this past week. So live cattle, Friday AMS called the 5-market average right at 115. That's up about $2 from the prior week. Feeder cattle, AMS nationally called steady to up $4, depending on what weight class and market. I will note the total volume in many major markets was the highest for the fall run. There was a bigger run back in January if you look at the calendar year. But for the fall run, we had a large number and prices were up, which is a really good thing. Here in Kansas, AMS called the market flat to $3 higher. 2 different lots to give us context. There's a lot of 700 head weighing 528, went for 162. Another big lot of 492 head weighing 678 on average, went for 150. Live cattle December contract was 119 and change on Friday. That's about flat for the week. I'll remind us it's up about $15 from the quote-unquote low of September 9th. Feeder cattle, the November contract was over 147 on Friday, down about 50 cents. So let's call it flat for the week, and it's up almost $14 from that same September 9th period. To put a bow around that, the wholesale beef market was very strong this past week. Cash market for feeder cattle and fed cattle were flat to strong, depending on exactly what you quote, and the board was basically flat. So there's more optimism we like in the cash market, but we didn't give anything up on the board either.
In fact, you'll be posting several sets of data on the agmanager.info website here within the week on meat demand, domestic and export, as well as the latest feedlot returns calculations, Glynn.
Yeah, all 3 of those efforts, most of our listeners, I hope, are aware. They're on our agmanager.info website. They're monthly post, and they get posted somewhere between the 10th and 15th of every month. We're sitting here on Monday, so I'm noting the data I need to do it is going to come out on Wednesday. So most likely on Wednesday they'll be posted. But to forecast a little, I anticipate positive stories really in all 3 tools. To do them in reverse order, given what we just got done talking about, the feedlot series was improved notably a month ago, and some of our listeners know, I believe last time I was on the segment we talked about that. That story is the same and maybe even slightly improved. So, steady she goes, if not a little bit better, which is part of why the feeder cattle demand is as strong as it is, I noted before. Looking over at the meat demand story, I anticipate domestic as well as export demand have held their own. Most of our listeners know I measure that not just for beef, but also for pork and poultry products as well. So look for that. That remains really important to watch for lots of reasons. But among them would be is we're on the front end of, let's just call it some debate about what the January cattle inventory report is going to be. Why am I bringing that up now? The status of beef demand, what that means for feeder cattle prices here at the end of 2019, and what that does to plans for cow-calf producers going forward are all in one related story here. And yours truly thinks we've probably peaked the herd and we're done expanding. I don't necessarily see a big pullback in herd size, but kind of the plateauing as we go. But we're going to start having that quote-unquote debate more and more over the next few weeks.
Now, you have been speaking and will continue to share information on this topic of alternative protein products. You were recently in Arizona for the U.S. Meat Export Federation meeting, a strategic planning conference is what they called it. What were you passing along there, Glynn?
So I was asked to speak, and I was actually part of a panel talking on the topic of alternative proteins. And, to paraphrase was, what's the broad status, think 30,000-foot level kind of summary of what's going on. And the best I could kind of summarize what the implications of that are in that particular meeting for U.S. beef and pork exports. When I use the term alternative proteins here, Tonsor is at least referring to proteins that did not originate from a live animal, such as a traditional ribeye steak or a traditional pork chop and those kind of things that were procured from a live animal, but are designed to be protein offerings for the public as potential substitutes for those live animal-based proteins.
So these are the lab-based and plant-based protein products.
All of those, and part of the reason I do that is it's not only the plant-based. Those are in the marketplace now, and that's what we're talking the most about, but there's going to be more alternatives, hence the term, to those going forward. And I think we need to look at those first and foremost as one big bucket as potential substitutes for live animal products, and then they each have their own pros and cons, and some aren't even on the market yet. But that's where I start there, is there substitutes for traditional live animal products for some people, and try to give some context. So, to paraphrase here, where are we at? There are several particularly plant-based protein products that are on the market, both in the food service restaurant channel as well as the retail grocery channel. Beyond Meat, Impossible Burger, you have several of these that are more well-recognized than others, but there's actually a long list of these products. Most of those products, particularly through the retail grocery store channel, they're sold at a much higher price than traditional beef products. And one of the examples I gave last week at that talk was BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics, puts out the month of September. Ground beef price across the U.S. was, I believe, like $4.40 or $4.45, something around that $4.40, $4.50 per pound price, where most of these other products are 2 or 3x that price. So you're talking a substantial price premium. Nobody's forcing anybody to pay that, but that's the asking price, and they are selling some products for that. So there's a big price differential. So those that are most price sensitive and probably the lower income segments are not the target market in the short term, is one thing you take from that. There have been a few studies done. There's more economic work that needs to be done for sure, and I'm sincere on that. There's an awful lot of economic questions yet to be answered. But what we do see so far is higher income, those that label themselves as vegan or vegetarian tend to be the most often interested parties in purchasing these products. Yet, I will note I've shared, I think, flexitarians, which is the segment of the population that is sympathetic to vegan and vegetarian diet styles but still eats meat sometimes, probably not as often as yours truly does, but nonetheless. So they're not 100% anti-meat and milk and egg products, but they try not to eat them as regularly as the Tonsor household does, to make my point. I think the flexitarian group is a rational next target for these products. And the reason I highlight that and I share it with traditional livestock audiences is there is a sizable portion of the U.S. population that self-identifies as flexitarian. So it's a pretty small segment that's vegan and vegetarian. Depending on whose estimates you use, that's 3 to 6% of the U.S. population. Flexitarians, some would estimate up to a third of the U.S. population. So the reason that matters, of course, is the eligible target market potentially goes from 5% to maybe 40%, and therefore the relevancy of these products becomes more important if the typical flexitarian is willing to make a switch. So we need to monitor that. I think that's core, and that's part of what I was trying to share. Some of the other things I was trying to highlight specific to trade is, and this is prudent for our beef listeners, is to date we import a lot of lean product from other countries, so Australia, New Zealand, other countries, and we mix it with less lean product here in the U.S., particularly from steers and heifers, to hit a given fat and lean target mix in a ground beef product. There's lots of economic reasons we do that I won't bore us with. It's just optimal to do that from an economist perspective. I could envision a world in the future where these alternative products, alternative protein products that is, are more readily available and cheaper than they are today, and they became a new source of highly lean protein that goes into those ground products. We're already seeing a few current major protein companies in the U.S. do blends of plant-based protein with live animal-based. That's occurring. I was basically saying I think it's going to speed up and do more of that. As the price of these alternatives comes down, that seems fairly likely to me. And I highlighted it in our trade discussion because it has a direct impact, if I'm correct on that, on it will reduce the volume we import of highly lean because we'll substitute the source of that highly lean here at home, and probably has notable implications for the general politics of trade because a lot of trade discussions are around net exports where you account for both what you import and export and say, are we exporting more than we're importing?
Distilling it down, Glynn, it still comes back to that main question that's on producers' minds. Can these alternative protein products and traditional meat products coexist economically in the marketplace?
Yes, and I have used the term, I think there's room for coexistence. The reason I think so is that most folks think there's a fixed amount of pie out there, right? A protein pie that we have to fight over and chase. And if that's true, a new product that comes in, by definition, gains market share and squeezes you out. That's where the mindset comes from. But the logic changes if that size of that pie changes. And for several years now, we have seen protein demand grow, not just in the U.S., but for the world. Yours truly anticipates global protein demand will continue to grow. And as the demand for protein grows, the size of the pie, quote unquote, will grow. And one of the things I actually belabored in Arizona, and I intend to belabor in all these talks going forward, is you can, quote unquote, lose market share and yet be better off than you were 10 years ago. And that's because the pie can grow. And yes, your percentage of the pie might shrink as competition grows, but you still might have a bigger piece of pie. Over time, we do have notable variation, and we're consuming about 25 to 30 pounds of meat per person in the U.S. more than we were a decade ago. So you can have both beef, pork, and poultry products go up in poundage in that story, and we have had some of that occur in that example. Why couldn't you also have more consumption of these alternative products and maintain, if not grow, demand for beef, pork, and traditional chicken products?
And your analysis is now available on Ag Manager likewise, if folks would like to check it out?
Yes. So the slides I used from the meetings in Tucson, Arizona last Thursday, they are up on agmanager.info. You're welcome to look at those. As always, if there's any questions or comments, as long as they're civil, you are welcome to give me a call or email.
Excellent. agmanager.info. We'll welcome you back here in a few weeks, Glynn. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Those observations on the cattle markets and the accompanying trends from Glynn Tonsor, livestock economist, K-State Research and Extension. And we'll return with more on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today continues now. Sustainability in cattle production. To many, it's an abstract sort of thing, but it gets a lot of run in conversations about beef production these days. Recently, the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State hosted an individual from the Beef Checkoff program who regularly works under that sustainability banner. Her name is Sara Place, and she joined the Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, and Bob Weaber for a round-table visit about this topic.
Sara, you do a lot of work in sustainability, travel around, talk about it. Tell us a little about your job.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the senior director of the Beef Checkoff funded sustainability research program. So we fund research at land-grant universities, including K-State, all around the United States and USDA, and essentially we benchmark where we're at with regard to sustainability in the U.S. beef industry, and then we identify areas where we can improve. And then a lot of what I do is disseminating that information, right? Getting that info out there to a whole wide array of audiences, from people in agriculture to people that are food bloggers or food writers.
Tell us a little about, like you said, some of the research. And can you give me a couple examples of what some of those projects would be?
Yeah, so one of the big things that we've been doing over the last several years has been life cycle assessment. So your listeners can think about that as just essentially environmental accounting, right? So we look at the whole supply chain of beef from feed production all the way to the consumer's plate, and we identify, where are our environmental impacts. And that helps us kind of hone in on what the hot spots are and understand where we can improve, and also communicate a lot better, this is what our actual environmental impacts are, not, a global analysis or anything else, but U.S. specific.
And that's important because the production industries are different. And on that ledger, it's not just economics. It would include things like water, greenhouse gas, what other types of resources are used to produce beef.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's one of the challenges with sustainability, as you alluded to earlier, is the definition is quite broad. And so it's a big umbrella that a whole bunch of issues fall under, right? So from economic viability to water use to land use, all these different things are things that people have questions about. And essentially how those conversations usually go is when you address one, they say, well, what about? What about something else, right? So we have to cover all those bases.
What percent of the grain in the U.S. goes to finishing cattle?
It's somewhere around 9-10% of the corn, the harvested corn grain in the United States, actually ends up going to beef cattle. So going back to that life cycle assessment research that I talked about we do, that's been a big part of it, is understanding, what are producers feeding, and then we can kind of get that macro level, like zoom out to the whole United States. And so we know 90% of what the feed is that goes into beef cattle is actually either forage or then all the byproduct feeds that we use. And then only about 10% is grain. And so that's really how we get to that point of not using as much grain as people think.
So when we talk about grain finished versus grass finished, am I interpreting what you're saying that even in the grain finished cattle, 90% of it is from forage or byproduct feed?
That's correct. Yeah. So we talk about grain finished beef in the United States, and of course that is what kind of separates us from the rest of the world, is that flavor and that efficiency of grain finishing. But we almost do a disservice by emphasizing grain so much, because at the end of the day, beef is a forage-based industry, right?
Yeah.
It's a grass-based industry, and I don't think we have communicated that well to the outside audience.
And the first 5 to 7 months of their life, they're eating grass, and then maybe even after that for a while.
Yeah, great converters of, and I liked your comment yesterday. We're utilizers of solar radiation, right? So
Yep.
we do that through, our cows rather do that through consumption of grass. I thought it was interesting. You pointed out the amount of grain, but that represents 2% of the tilled acres, as I understood it, which I think most of us think, well, beef production is a huge industry, $70-80 billion of farm gate receipts. We use a lot of resources, but compared to the rest of the resource use in our production system, it's a really small fraction.
So 2% of the, so if I'm driving around and I see corn, 2% of that corn
2% of
is
U.S. cropland acres go to the beef industry.
Right. So, I mean, that's what comes down to the advantage of ruminants, right? So we kind of, in the beef cattle industry, I think people are familiar, we almost kind of get beat over the head with the fact that cattle are ruminants and they make methane and all this stuff, but it's a huge advantage from a sustainability standpoint, because...
That's where they fit in Mother Nature.
That's absolutely right, yeah. So
and it's
that's...
the upcycle bit.
That's exactly. So when we think about upcycling, that's just taking something that's of little or no value and making a higher value product, and that's what cattle are doing every single day, right? They take that human inedible stuff and the land bases that we can't use. And then to your point, Bob, right? I mean, like we should market beef as, it's a photosynthetic product, right? Like, hey, this came out of the air just a few months ago, right? That's pretty good.
I'm a vegetarian because I eat the vegetarian.
That's
right.
right. That's right. Beef is the original plant-based, protein, so we should market that.
And it is a lot of forage base, and most of us, and especially on the cow-calf side, you see that because it's almost entirely forage based. But even then, if you do and this is where I think the research that you've done, Sarah, really comes into play, is when you look at the whole life cycle of those cattle, it's very different than if I only look at the last 30 days or 60 days before they were harvested. It's a different ration, but that calf lived a longer period of time, and the resources, 90% of that was forage based. Sarah, I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask Weber to give me an opinion from a cow-calf perspective. A lot of our cow-calf producers are confronted with, and they hear sustainability. And I'll say, with some of us, you go, I don't know what that means, I'm not sure it's my problem. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you if it is my problem, and Bob, I'm going to ask you as a cow-calf guy, what does sustainability mean on the cow-calf side?
Okay. Very good.
Yeah, so just to define it at a very high level, right, sustainability is about balancing three different areas, right? Economics, social issues, and environmental issues. And, of course, we hear most about the environment, but it's important to emphasize, right, economic viability is criteria number one for sustainability, right? If you're not able to stay in business, you're not going to be sustainable. And those social issues, that's everything from thinking about animal welfare to some of the things that we just mentioned about nutrition and can people afford food. So it absolutely is relevant to everyone in the beef supply chain, because I hope that's becoming more clear now, right? As we see more and more news articles on this topic, and we see more pressure put on foods of all types to demonstrate what are you all doing, right? And that's going to be more of that expectation of not just what's the price of food, what's the nutritional value to me, but how did it get to my plate, and was it responsibly produced? Is going to be a consumer expectation that grows in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sarah, that we have sort of this as members of our society and as businesses in that society, an obligation to our consumers and an obligation to our resources to use them wisely. And I think oftentimes producers don't conceptualize their role in that as simply as we can. We talk sustainability, and they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't know how to engage that conversation. And I think one of the big challenges we have is that most of the voices in the conversation are the people that are either opponents or don't have all the facts, and we need to increase the number of participants in that discussion from our perspective that have facts, and producers provide a great point of communication for that. And so I want them to be engaged in that discussion and sort of make the connection between the things they do every day and how those contribute to sustainability. Because we're forage-based and because we're good stewards of the land and we produce animals humanely, those are all real positive sustainability messages.
And Bob, we're already doing some of that with, like, we talk about grazing plans.
Exactly. I mean, because economic sustainability is really tied in with the rest of sustainability, in that, if I'm going to be economically sustainable, I'm going to, first of all, make sure that I have the water resources I need, the grazing resources that I need to keep my ranch in place for the next generation as well. And those become really win-win situations. Those are the stories I think we need to do a little better job telling to the public that, I want this grassland that I'm using for my ranch to be around for my children, so therefore I'm going to have a grazing management plan. I'm going to utilize my forage to the best. I'm going to try to get as much production as I can, but I'm not going to sacrifice this year's production for next year's production. So I'm going to wisely use my grazing forages. I'm going to wisely use my water resources, because I don't want to just have a bumper crop this year. I want to be in business for the long term.
Everybody's important. Telling your story, and it doesn't have to be on a big scale or giving a speech. It is when you go to the basketball game or the football game. There are people in your community that don't know a lot about ag. Let's be transparent.
Yeah, I think, we sometimes make it way more complicated than we need to, right? And ultimately, I think for our producers, it's just as simple as saying, you know what, thank you for buying beef, because when you're doing that, you're supporting this grassland, you're supporting this family, right? That's all it has to be. It's just connecting that for people, is that this product that you're buying that's really good for your health and actually very nutritious is also supporting all these things that you want, right? And again, for cow-calf producers, I think that's where you guys kind of have everything that everybody wants from a sustainability perspective. The bucolic scene, the family farming, the whole thing. And so I think it's almost mind-boggling how we've gotten into a situation where beef is seen as unsustainable when it's, from that perspective, again, our major inputs into beef are sunlight, CO2 out of the air, and rainwater, right? Yeah. So those are renewable resources. I think we're doing okay, right? Like that's a very sustainable system.
That's Sara Place, the Senior Director of the Beef Checkoff Sustainable Research Program. Sara joined there by Bob Weaber, Bob Larson, and Brad White of the Beef Cattle Institute at K-State. This, by the way, an excerpt from one of the latest BCI Cattle Chat podcasts, which you can hear in full at beefcattleinstitute.org. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
You're listening to Agriculture Today on the K-State Radio Network. Glad to have you along on this Veterans Day 2019. And you've already heard it numerous times today, but it bears repeating. When you see a vet today, whomever it might be, wherever it may be sure to thank them for their service. Well, based on conditions as of November the 1st, Kansas' 2019 corn crop is forecast at a record high 798 million bushels. That would be up 24% from last year's production. This according to the USDA in its latest grain supply and demand report issued Friday morning. The harvested acreage will be at 6 million. That's up 20% from a year ago, and the corn yield for Kansas forecast at 133 bushels per acre. That's up 4 bushels from last year. Grain sorghum at 206 million bushels, down 11% from last year. The harvested acreage at 2.4 million, down 9% from 2018. And the grain sorghum yield forecast is at 86 bushels per acre, down 2 bushels from last year. And soybean production in Kansas forecast at 200 million bushels, down 1% from last year. Harvested acreage at 4.5 million, 3% below 2018. And the Kansas soybean yield at 44 bushels per acre, up a bushel from last year. Cotton production, by the way, at 280,000 bales forecasted. That would be down 18% from last year. Cotton acreage at a record high, 160,000 acres, up 8,000 from last year, but the yield forecast at 840 pounds per acre, down 237 pounds per acre from a year ago. Nationally, the USDA expects the nation's corn producers to harvest 13.6 billion bushels of corn this year. That pulls into a national average yield of 167 bushels per acre. That's a decline of 100 million bushels and 1.4 bushels per acre from the October report. Soybean production at 3.5 billion bushels, down slightly from last month. The national average yield estimated at 46.9 bushels per acre, unchanged from last month. Here's more on the national numbers from the USDA's Rod Bain.
Production of major spring planted crops were adjusted down month over month in USDA's latest crop production report. The November report cites corn production forecast down 1% from October, soybean production down slightly, and cotton production forecast decreased by 4% from the previous month. The trend in lower production forecast for these crops stems from adjusted yield forecast lower in November. The lower production outlook also contributed to changes in the season-ending average price estimate for many of these crops. For instance, the midpoint price for corn is now up a nickel month over month to $3.85 a bushel, while the season-ending average price for cotton rose 3 cents from October. Soybean prices, however, remained unchanged month over month, still at $9 a bushel at the midpoint, due primarily to an increase in domestic bean ending stocks. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
House Agriculture Committee Chairman Colin Peterson says that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wants to get the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement vote on the fast track. He says, quoting him, "It's going to get done. The question is if it's going to get done in these next 2 weeks or done in December." Peterson noted that Pelosi talked about the push to pass USMCA on a caucus conference call last week. The USMCA working group has been meeting with U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer to negotiate the changes to the trade agreement required to get the votes from both sides of the aisle. Peterson says he anticipates that the work will clear the way for rapid approval in all 3 countries. And the second installment of the Market Facilitation Program, MFP2 payments to farmers, has been approved. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue confirmed that in a press call with reporters. He said that he received authorization on the second tranche of aid payments, and the USDA is working to get those ready, hopefully by the end of this month into early December. Asked if another MFP effort in 2020 is in the cards, the Secretary said he hoped that the U.S.-China deal could temper the need for such an effort. The USDA has paid out $6.7 billion under the MFP program so far, under the version 2 of the program. On we go now to this week's edition of Tree Tales. Here's K-State Forester Bob Atchison. Bob?
Windbreaks and shelter belts have been providing benefits to the people of Kansas since the settlers began planting trees. In 2018, state forestry agencies in the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas inventoried the size and condition of windbreaks in an effort to sustain this valuable resource. The Great Plains Initiative, too, is funded by the USDA Forest Service, state and private forestry. This initiative will, for the first time, geospatially identify the location and condition of windbreaks throughout the Great Plains. It builds off of previous windbreak inventories conducted in 2008 and 2009. The initiative will assign ecosystem service values to windbreaks such as savings in soil erosion, energy, and livestock costs and crop yields. Cropland sites for potential windbreak plantings will be identified where wind erosion is a high risk. Risk assessment and economic impacts of invasive species will also be quantified. A plan for engaging farmers and ranchers in windbreak planting and renovation will be implemented. Early results suggest 55% of Kansas windbreaks are in fair to poor condition and in need of renovation, which is a slight decline since the 2008-2009 inventory. 24% of Kansas windbreaks are 50 years or older, with 44% between 25 to 50 years and 32% less than 25 years old. 61% of Kansas windbreaks protect farmsteads, 26% croplands, and 11% livestock. Dominant trees include eastern red cedar leading the pack, making up 54% of all trees, followed by 11% made up of Scotch, ponderosa, and Austrian pine. This is a concern for foresters since pine diseases will continue to cause mortality and reduce the functioning condition of windbreaks. Kansas Forest Service foresters are available to help farmers and ranchers design and plan windbreak plantings and renovation projects. They can also help find financial assistance to cover project costs through USDA programs like EQIP and Continuous CRP. Why not call us today at 785-532-3300 or check us out on the web at www.kansasforest.org. This is Bob Atchison, encouraging you to actively care for, manage, and protect the woodlands and windbreaks of our state. You've been listening to another Tree Tale.
Many thanks, Bob, and you're tuned to Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. We all have to eat, so it should be no surprise that Foods and Nutrition is one of the most popular project areas for Kansas 4-H youth. As part of this project, youth learn how to cook the basics and then advance to gourmet and international meals. In addition, Kansas 4-H Program Coordinator for Foods and Nutrition, Taylor Flowers, says that youth also learn the heritage of many foods, consumer buying skills, how to make healthy snacks, and how to modify recipes. Taylor, as we look at the Foods Nutrition Program through Kansas 4-H, I like the fact that it starts at a very early age, and they really are just trying to cover the basics.
Yeah, absolutely. In 4-H, we believe that every youth member has the opportunity to learn, and everyone has to eat. So what better time to start than start young, learning in the kitchen, learning the basics of foods and nutrition, learning the science behind it, and learning all about food safety.
One of the things they talk about is why food is important. That's really something that we have to understand.
Absolutely. And being in 4-H helps youth understand not only how to prepare the food, but also where their food's coming from. They have the background of ag and knowing farmers and ranchers around them.
This is kind of broken into age groups. Is that kind of how we try and do this program?
Yes. So when the youth will take foods to the fair, they're broken into an age group, so it's a little easier for them to compare and for the judges to see different age groups of youth and how they're able to progress and what they've been able to learn, since as they get older, you can do more in the kitchen and you can be more independent.
Yeah, that's interesting because once you kind of understand the basics, it's a lot easier to advance because it really is a food science, right?
That's exactly right. I went to college and studied food science, and it was all because in 4-H, I learned about foods and nutrition. I had such a love for the Foods and Nutrition Project, getting to see when you're baking bread, understanding what's going on in that, understanding that there's gluten being formed, and understanding that that's what makes the bread have the texture that it has, and that's what makes a bread different than a cake. And all of that came from just learning and experimenting in a kitchen through 4-H.
Talk a little bit about, as they age, you start with ages 7 and 8 and kind of cover the basics there, and then you just kind of keep adding on as they age through the program?
Absolutely, yeah. So starting at age 7 and 8, you see a lot of cookies. Our foods judges get a lot of cookies coming to the fair at that age because those are easy. Then as you get older, learning more about pies and cakes and breads and understanding the difference between all of those and how the technique that goes into them really helps the youth to learn more about that. And then as they get older, even more, learning about food safety practices, learning about canning, how to preserve food safely so that when you open that can up a little later on, you don't get sick from it.
That's one of the important things, isn't it, is the food safety aspect?
Absolutely. Food safety is a very big passion, especially with canned products. It isn't always known to the youth that, especially like when you go up in altitude, you have to take your canning time up. And so that's one of the things that the Foods and Nutrition Project is really trying to push and help the youth understand a little more, is that there's a lot of food safety things that you didn't know, but a recipe usually accounts for that. So just making sure that you use a good approved recipe, especially for canning, to make sure that they have accounted for the food safety things so that you don't open up that can in a year when you run out of green beans and get sick from that or something like that.
In terms of the nutrition side, what type of things are you trying to point out through the program?
Yeah, so one of the big things, obviously, is MyPlate, using the MyPlate guidelines to help youth understand how to eat in a way that makes their body feel good, makes them feel fueled and energized for the day.
One of the things that they're really trying to stress is the more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains.
Yes, absolutely. Using the MyPlate, it's easy for kids to see that they should have fruits and vegetables on their plate. They should have protein. They should have a grain. And so it really provides that good visual, especially for kids that are visual learners, to be able to see that the MyPlate needs to have this portion of each of those.
This also helps them understand that diversity is important in what they're eating?
Absolutely. So you can see on the MyPlate that half of your plate should be fruits and vegetables, getting all sorts of, they call it the rainbow of fruits and vegetables, different colors of fruits and vegetables, as well as grains and proteins in there too.
Kind of along those same lines, you talked about the fact that this also helps them learn where foods come from, but it also helps them to be smart consumers too. You talk about some of the consumer aspects as well.
Yeah, youth are able to learn about the products, about different brands even. I know with Foods and Nutrition, when I was in 4-H, and it's still happening, we were able to tour a flour mill and see exactly how the flour goes through the process. We were able to see how one brand was able to do something a little different or the same as another brand.
Part of this is also learning then to compete and make sure that your foods are ready for competition?
Yeah, so obviously we encourage the youth to practice their foods when they take it to the fair. You never want to take a food to the fair that is the first time you've ever tried that product, because you can end up with a judge that's a little surprised if something didn't quite turn out the way you thought it was going to.
Talk a little bit about what you've learned from this program, because not only are you kind of overseeing the program, but you've also been through this program.
Yeah, some of the things I really learned is that food safety aspect that I never really understood when I was younger, how important it was that I kept hot foods hot and I kept cold foods cold and made sure to keep food at the right temperature and get it cooled off really quick if we were done and it needed to go in the fridge. And as I got older, I started to learn more of the science behind it and understood more about bad bacteria that can grow in it. And so that's one of the really big things that I think is really interesting, is learning about the food safety aspects.
And this is also a program that boys and girls both enjoy.
Oh, absolutely. Some of the best things that I think I've ever seen at a fair came from boys, and then we have some amazing girls that are also in the Foods and Nutrition Project. I mean, everyone has to eat is what I always kind of go back to. So learning to cook for yourself, learning to bake is an important, vital lesson for anyone.
And as you know, it's important that you learn how to cook, because you're not going to always be able to eat out.
That's absolutely right. And I think being in the kitchen, a lot of kids and a lot of people find a lot of joy in it, as I do, and just being able to get that hands-on and then see what you made and taste it and try again and do new things. It's a fun experiment every time.
Certainly something that you see a lot of on social media.
Oh, yes, absolutely. There's a ton of YouTube people. There's a ton of people on Instagram. It's really almost a trend, but I hope it stays as more than a trend.
Taylor, if somebody wants to find out more about the program, how can they do that?
Go to the kansas4h.org and then go to the Foods and Nutrition page.
That's Kansas 4-H Program Coordinator for Foods and Nutrition, Taylor Flowers. Again, to learn more about the Foods and Nutrition Project area, visit kansas4h.org. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. Thanks for joining us. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.